seminal work on the history of olfaction, the full and the fragrant. Alain Corbin notes that smells are at the heart of many discriminations and social hierarchies. Corbin and many other historians after him demonstrated how smells were invoked as a means of social classification associated with the prejudice surrounding prostitutes, peasants, and poor people, as can be seen in this caricature from the second half of the 19th century. In this short communication, I would like to present a small part of my current research on the smell of paint in France during the 18th and 19th centuries. I would like to introduce the way in which social considerations associated with the sense of smell affected the classification between artists, craftsmen, and workers that was at stake during this period. Indeed, the fight of artists for social recognition was intensified after the revolution due to the liberalization of the art market. Stressing the material nature of painting, the smell of paint was often perceived as conflicting with the intellectual nature of art. Far from being anecdotal as it is today, the smell of paint was an important issue at this time. To give an idea of the extent of the problem, at the end of the 18th century, it was recommended to wait at least 1 year before moving into a freshly painted apartment. The only means of reducing this delay was to place several chlorine tanks in the room to deodorize it. Today, it is strange to imagine that people were highly inconvenienced by the famous and beautiful vernis Martin that adorn the rooms of the Palace of Versailles. According to the correspondence of Galliani, the smell of varnish was even more unbearable than the cries of little children. This problem has been widespread for a very long time. At the end of the 19th century, hygiene manuals and medical writings still carried warnings relating to the smell of paint and varnish. Obviously, the health problems caused by the smell of paint, which ranged from headache to merely death, particularly affected the workers who made and applied the paints and varnish. However, it was also an issue for artists who, according to technical treatises of the art of painting, used cloves or essential oil of lavender to mask its unpleasant odor. Such recipes may be found in the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci and in many other treatises, such as that of Roger de Pile. Initially linked to the secrets of paint manufacturing, the addition of perfume became common practice as the manufacture of paint and varnish became industrialized. Between the mid-18th century and the mid-19th century. This is reflected in the numerous advertisements, such as this, promoting odorless paint for decorative or artistic purpose. However, it is of course a medical discourse that provides the most in-depth treatment of the issue of the smell of paint. In 1757, the famous Dr. Tronchin published a book relating to the dreaded disease attributed to the smell of lead in color, De Colica Pictonum, quickly translated into English under the title A Treatise on the Colica Pictonum and the Dry Belly Hack. His essay was followed in 1788 by a competition launched by the Royal Academy of Sciences, which encouraged the writing of a thesis relating to the following subject: color grinders, their profession, and their disease. The author, who won the first prize, a Belgian painter named Léonard de France, produced a very thorough report on the topic. Subsequently, painter's Colic was still the subject of much research until the middle of the 19th century. Nérat de Vaumarthoise and Tancrel Desplanches, among others, devoted themselves to this question, analyzing not only the symptoms of the disease, but also the circumstances in which it appeared. In all these books, there was no doubt that the disease was caused by the presence of lead among the materials. In her recent book, Judith Rennon has faithfully traced the history of this deadly poison. Surprisingly, the contamination was always attributed to the smell of materials. Nérat de Vaumarthoise could not be clearer when writing that only smells can cause this disease. Tancrel Desplanches quoted an example in his book that during restoration work at the Palace of Versailles, painters and gilders working in the same room were equally affected by the disease, even though the gilders did not use lead. He also noted that the room ventilation helped to dissipate the symptoms of both craftsmen. There is therefore a relative consensus concerning the causes of the painter's colic. However, should the olfactory causes of this disease not be called into question, many people, on the other hand, would contest the possibility of artists contracting this disease, of which house painters, in principle, are victims. Debates relating to these subjects have been particularly fierce. According to Tronchin, painter's colic was responsible for the death of Raphael and Correggio. Bouvard contrasts this argument with a list of counter-examples, quoting painters such as Mignard, Le Lorrain, or Rigaud, who have lived long lives despite the regular use of toxic materials. Bouvard termed workers unfortunate victims of luxury before comparing them with famous artists. This irony reveals the social and political stakes of his criticism of Tronchin. Furthermore, Bouvard insisted on the argument that the house painters make their own color, while artists used material already prepared by others, a practice that is, of course, less artisanal. According to Bouvard, artists are not spared by the nature of their materials, and they use colors that are well known for their toxicity, such as lead, ultramarine, or vert de gris. However, in his view, this toxicity does not affect artists and craftsmen in the same way because the former are exposed to smaller quantities. Indeed, as it has been known since antiquity, the dose makes the poison. Bouvard also makes a detailed comparison on the way in which artists work and the method of the house painters he calls barbouilleur. While artists put 2 or 3 grains of color on their tiny paintbrush and took lengthy breaks through the day, house painters put an ounce of paint at a time on their brush and worked all day long. However, if the delicacy of the painter's work makes them less sensitive to the toxicity of their materials, this meant that a sick painter might not be a true artist. This is the view of Tancrel Desplanches, who also believes that painters of canvas cannot be affected by the painter's colic. He related the following anecdote. A painter, presenting himself as a portrait painter, arrived at the hospital with symptoms of the disease. The doctor did not believe that he could have contracted it while working on a portrait painter as a portrait painter and questioned him until the patient admitted, finally, that shortly beforehand he had painted 54 boxes of flowers and, in so doing, had fulfilled the duties of a house painter. Tancrel adds several arguments to this example, namely that the pigments used by painters on canvas are finer and, above all, that artists are cleaner, which was in line with the social prejudices of the time. Later, in the 19th century, many doctors believed that the habit of smoking common among painters protected them from the fumes given off by paint. An interesting point in relation to this medical approach of artists' practices is that it questions the relationship between work and art at a time when the nature of artists' work was once again being questioned, particularly with regard to the financial evaluation of artworks. However, the medical discourse relating to the Colic of painters also informs on the complexity of this professional field. It highlights not only the multitude of craft professions involving the use of its substances, but also the diversity of professions related to the painting of canvas that had not been fortunate enough to have had the necessary posterity to remain in being. Thus, there were portrait painters who could produce several portraits a day at a very low cost, decorative painter who decorated interior, crockery, etc., such as Renoir in his early days, as well as painters who colored printed images or who produced copies of work of art. In all these fields, the relationship between art and craft, between creation and work, was questioned in relation to the disease and more precisely by the nature of the use of materials, the quality used, and the duration of the workday. The medical discourse concerning painters' Colic also highlights other nuances in the status of different artists. For example, in his treatise on color grinders, Léonard de France noted that the disease spared more Parisian than provincials because the latter had fewer opportunities than the inhabitants of the capital to use the services of color grinders and had to do it by themselves. Subsequently, the medical issues related to the smell of paint continued to evolve. From the turn of the 19th century onwards, the concept of smell became associated with the nerves. The smell of paint, and more precisely that of turpentine, became a reason for painters sensitive to odors to abandon that vocation. Obviously, these warnings of the danger of the smell of paint were a major factor in convincing women never to practice oil painting, even as a hobby. To conclude this overview of the medical discourse on the smell of paint in relation to the changing social status of artists, I would like to propose an epilogue that will take us to the beginning of 20th century to the avant-garde period. Indeed, from my perspective, it seems significant to see these questions reappearing in writings relating to art at a time when the very concept of art is being radically transformed and its relationship to work is being rethought. Thus, in the Russian context, Malevich reproached a young painter for his hot bursts of idealization by recommending him to sniff a little turpentine in the morning, while Marcel Duchamp, mocking the attachment of certain artists to traditional mediums, blames them for being intoxicated by turpentine. He also described their creative process as requiring an olfactory masturbation stimulated by the smell of paint. These two examples show us that the sense of the smell of paint carries much more than just toxic elements. It also conveys and sometimes contradicts the different values associated to the artistic practice of painting. Thank you.